Tonight on Nova, trumpeter swans, Atlantic eels, bats, monarch butterflies. They all have one thing in common. To survive, they must follow a fierce urge to migrate. How animals find their way is the mystery of animal pathfinders. To be an animal is to be on the move, and an animal migration is a special kind of movement. Some migrations are marathon transcontinental odysseys between homes that are hemispheres apart. Animals migrate once a day, once a season, or once a lifetime. How animals manage their feats of endurance and navigation is the mystery at the heart of these great adventures. This is the story of the Animal Pathfinders. It's April in southernmost Brazil, over 2,000 miles south of the equator. This desolate shore is one of the few places in the world to look for clues to the mysteries of one of the longest of all bird migrations. This team of Brazilian scientists, part of a worldwide network, has come here to catch and band birds going north for the summer. The birds they are looking for are redknots, small shorebirds a little larger than robins, almost always on the move. Now they are on the way to the Canadian Arctic. After dark, some of the birds will careen into these gossamer-thin nets, and the team will measure and band them. Each bird they catch will add its own story to the history of its species. But this information is hard to come by. The next place these birds can be seen and studied in any numbers will be 4,000 miles to the north at Cape May, New Jersey. Each spring, it is a mecca for migratory shorebirds. This is the time of year when thousands of horseshoe crabs come ashore to mate and lay eggs. The eggs they lay are a high-energy delicacy for arriving migratory birds, and the coincidence of the two gatherings is perfectly timed. This redknot has come non-stop from South America, and there is nowhere else on the Atlantic seaboard where it can refuel as it can here. As the tide drops, this large female and her suitors are stranded, and rows of eggs are left exposed on the beach. These eggs have plenty of protein and carbohydrate to fuel the next leg of the redknot's journey. The redknot is a specialist. It feeds only where beaches are exposed by the tides. Oblivious to the inroads made by hungry birds, the horseshoe crabs make their way ashore, as they have once a year for hundreds of millions of years, when the moon is full and the tides are high. Redknots have no experience of winter in either hemisphere. They follow a perpetual summer, traveling great distances between seasonal feasts such as this one. This annual banquet attracts birds and bird watchers alike. Scientist Brian Harrington was alerted by the Brazilians when the redknots left for the north. He has brought a group from the Manomet Bird Observatory of Plymouth, Massachusetts for an annual banding operation.
Oh, isn't that neat? That's the breeding ground song. Yeah.
The researchers select a spot where the knots will be feeding on eggs. They lay out a net that will be shot over the birds with an explosive charge, trapping them harmlessly on the beach. After a wait, the redknots return and begin feeding. When the birds are in front of the net, it's fired. Banding and recapture records reveal some basic facts about speed, flyway routes, and winter and summer quarters. But knowing these logistical details only deepens some of the other puzzles of the redknot migration. How the redknot knows where to go, how to stay on course, and when to stop, no one fully understands. This small bird is one of the world's fastest and most fuel-efficient migrators. But how its metabolism really works is still something of a mystery.
Hey, all right. This bird was marked in southern Brazil. It was marked by a Brazilian team this year, in April. Oh, is this year's bird, right? Yeah, and you can tell because of the blue flag here. It's got a Brazilian bird band on it, and was probably marked very late April or early May, 2 or 3 weeks ago in southernmost Brazil.
This bird may have stopped on the north coast of South America, and from there the trip may have been non-stop, taking only a few days. Migrations such as this one require the greatest level of exertion of any vertebrate in the world.
Call it 197.
A redknot may lose 50% of its body weight getting here, and may gain it back as quickly by gorging on the eggs of the horseshoe crab.
And then on the upper leg, it's a green flag. Okay, and that bird is all decorated and ready to go to the Arctic. Redknot. Here we go.
The redknot's ability to fly great distances means its young can fatten up in one of the most productive seasonal environments on Earth. Summer in the Arctic. The Arctic spring is a brief season, bursting with new life under the 24-hour sunlight. Migratory birds make flights of thousands of miles to reach this short-lived but unparalleled seasonal food supply. Many kinds of birds come here to feed and grow, to build strength for the long flight south. Redknots face a 10,000-mile marathon from the top of the world. In July, they leave nesting grounds on Victoria Island in the Canadian Arctic. Groups are seen at James Bay, Ontario, and then on the coast of Massachusetts and New Jersey in August. Only about 30% of all redknots show up at these known staging areas. A few are seen in Venezuela in September. Many on the coast of Argentina in October. And then, Tierra del Fuego, where they meet the missing 70%. Where they have been since August, no one knows. In April, they move north again, turning in to refuel at that very special stretch of beach in southernmost Brazil. In April of 1986, the redknots were an example of the exception that proves the rule. Migratory birds don't stay long where they can't eat well. Heavy rains and gale winds affected food supplies, and the redknots didn't come here in their usual numbers. Where there were thousands the year before, there was only a handful in 1986. What makes this place special is a huge lake just behind the dunes, usually a shallow sheet of water. But after so much rain, it's too deep for the knots to feed on the juvenile snails, as they usually do. Until recently, observers lost track of redknots as they flew north from Tierra del Fuego in the spring. Since this Brazilian staging area was discovered in 1984, researchers have been coming here to band the birds. But this year, the storms have scattered the redknots, showing that migratory paths can be as unpredictable as the weather. For 2 weeks, the team tends its nets. They will only catch about 600 birds in all, and just 60 of those will be knots. But of those 60, one was a knot banded at Cape May, New Jersey in 1983. It was caught here on April 20th, 1986, 40,000 miles and 3 years after its original capture. The team works all night banding birds. The plastic bands are fused with heat. They even paint the underside of their wings for recognition in flight. Redknots spend most of their lives on the move. Their particular form of globetrotting means they avoid winter. All animals need to survive the rigors of the environment, and migration is just one strategy. Seasonal change may bring bad weather, but far worse is the lack of food it causes. To solve this problem, animals have 3 basic choices. They can hole up, and beavers take this first choice, building their dams in the fall and then living quietly all winter without ever actually hibernating as some animals do. In the autumn, they cut branches ashore and add them to their dam, or to an underwater stockpile, which feeds them in the shelter of their lodge all winter long. Other animals, such as elk, take the second choice. They tough it out, exposed to the elements. As long as they can graze, they are well equipped to survive the cold. But harsh weather is an equalizer. It brings the severest test most animals will face. Starvation, predators, disease take a toll. Half a world away in Africa's Serengeti Plain, harsh conditions brought by an annual dry season forced the third choice on the wildebeest and other animals. They must journey hundreds of miles to find greener pastures. For terrestrial animals, such long migrations are unusual. Unable to leave the surface of the earth, most land animals have limits on their freedom to move. But for an animal that can swim or fly, there are fewer obstacles, and these are the great migrators, traveling enormous distances between feeding and breeding grounds. These animals are also pathfinders, for they often have to go where they have never gone before. Migrations are among the most demanding of animal enterprises. They require navigating with uncanny accuracy and performing great feats of physical endurance. And they do all this essentially out of our sight. But there are some simpler, less elusive organisms that must also move to live. And understanding them yields clues to the behavior of the great migrators. Just below the surface of this mudflat, there is a perpetual micro-migration taking place. For some bacteria, oxygen is a poison. The best way to avoid it is to stay deep in the mud. Bacteria like this exist all over the world. What they all have in common is a row of material called magnetite, iron particles that act like the magnetized needle of a compass when it responds to the magnetic field of the Earth. The Earth's magnetic field sweeps far out into space, and it intersects the surface at an angle, going down towards the giant magnet-like dynamo created by the churning molten iron at the Earth's core. In the northern hemisphere, north is downward, because the lines of force descend into the earth. Like the needle of a compass, the magnetite in these bacteria guides them down, away from the poison, oxygen. A magnet can temporarily reverse the local field, so they swim in the wrong direction. Each time the field's reversed, the bacteria do an about-face. Other kinds of bacteria thrive on oxygen. There's more of it near the surface of this air bubble. When these randomly swimming bacteria discover a concentration of oxygen, they converge on it. The Earth's magnetic field and very small changes in the concentration of a chemical are just two of the cues that guide organisms on their journeys. More complex animals can use these road signs too, but they also need increasingly sophisticated tools to direct their travels. Many of these migrations seem to use pinpoint navigation for extended round-trip travel. One of the most celebrated finds in animal behavior has been the discovery of how the honeybee navigates. Bees must search far and wide for food. They gather nectar and pollen from wildflowers that may be as far as half a mile from the hive. They may be a different kind from time to time, and their yield may vary. There are specialized forager bees whose job is to find flowers and then tell the rest of the hive where they are. But random searching may take the forager far from the hive. The bee's problem is how to tell the others where it has been. The problem is compounded by the bee's vision. This blurred mosaic is roughly what the world looks like to a bee, so it must be able to give accurate directions without relying on landmarks. Bee language is as complex as their social organization. This forager performs a repetitive dance which tells the others which direction to go in, how far to go, and what they will find when they get there. If the other bees want to know more, they make a special noise. If the forager doesn't stop dancing instantly, they will sting it to death. These bees want to know what kind of nectar and pollen they should be looking for. The forager has brought some back, which they sample with their antennae. The dance is a diagram of the trip, telling the others what heading to take relative to the sun. Each time the bee runs up and to the left, it conveys the same information. To find flowers, steer about 15 degrees to the left of the sun. Direction alone is not enough. The workers have to know how far to go. Bees can count, so the forager tells distance by the number of times it wags its abdomen. In this case, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Experiments have shown that this translates to 300 meters. With a heading and a distance, the bees now have the right directions. They're looking for goldenrod pollen and nectar, 15 degrees left of the sun, 300 meters away. But they can't see very well, so what kind of navigational aids does the bee have that enable it to follow these directions so accurately? Since the sun moves an average of 1 degree every 4 minutes, 15 degrees left of the sun isn't accurate for very long. So the bee must compensate for the sun's movement over time. The bee does this with a clock, accurate to within a few minutes over many hours. but no one has any idea just how this internal clock works. More is known about the solar compass in the eye of the bee that keeps it on course. A bee's compound eye is made of hundreds of tiny hexagonal lenses. Like a telescope, each lens sees a very narrow field of view. By sighting the sun through the correct lens for a particular time of day, the bee can hold a constant heading as it flies. And as the sun moves, the bee's internal clock tells it to sight through a series of adjacent lenses. Once it has a heading, the bee must measure the distance it was told to fly. For this, it has an odometer, which works by monitoring fuel consumption. The bee tells how far it has flown by measuring how much energy, in the form of honey, it's used up. A good thing, because it leaves the hive with only enough honey for the trip. Because of how a bee sees the world, vision alone is not enough to guide it on its way. Instead, it has an array of senses that act like sophisticated instruments. The bee learns the way from its mates and also from experience, and it travels many times a day. But there is another kind of migration, the great once-in-a-lifetime journey. Unlike honeybees, some animals must be born knowing how and when to go to far-off places they have never seen before. It's late summer in these New England hills, and one of the longest of all annual insect migrations is quietly taking shape. The key to this journey is the milkweed plant and a homing instinct carried by the brilliantly colored caterpillars of the monarch butterfly that are feeding on it. This is the fourth and last generation of the season. The caterpillars, the eggs, the pupae, even the adult butterflies of other species can survive the harsh northern winter, but the monarch cannot. After weeks of feeding and fast growth, the 3-inch caterpillar begins the miraculous transformation that will allow it to escape the certain death that winter would bring. In a few hours, the caterpillar has shed its skin, and the hard, protective casing of a chrysalis has formed. Inside, an utterly different creature is taking shape. And with it, the instinct to make a great migration. The earthbound caterpillar has grown wings, and it has inherited the ability to find its way on an epic journey out of all proportion to its apparent fragility. Using a long, slender tongue, it will now stoke up on nectar. Monarchs usually breed and then die within a few weeks, but not this generation. The temperature and day length may keep them from breeding, and that gives them 8 more months of life than their parents. The autumnal equinox seems to trigger the migration. Very little is known about how they navigate, but somehow they will find their way to the only known place they can survive the winter. One theory holds that monarchs may steer by the sun, correcting for its movement across the sky like honeybees. The monarchs that start in New England and eastern Canada have the longest trip. The monarchs west of the Rockies move to the coast of California, but the vast majority of North American monarchs, those east of the Rockies, move toward Mexico. When they cross the Tropic of Cancer, leaving cold temperatures far behind, they might be expected to disperse, but they don't. What they do instead is the greatest enigma of all. Having crossed half a continent, tens of millions of butterflies converge toward a pinpoint on the map of Mexico. A 30 by 50 mile area of high mountains and Spanish colonial towns. Except to the people who live here, the wintering colonies of the monarch butterfly were unknown until 1974. Above the hillside farms in the thin, cool air at 10,000 feet, there is a habitat that may be unique in Central America. Called the Transvolcanic Range, it is a rocky wilderness of ravines and fir forests. Since the butterfly colonies were discovered here in 1974, scientists like Lincoln Brower have been making annual visits of their own.
Scientists had long wondered where in the world monarch butterflies migrate to out of the whole eastern part of the United States. And over a 30-year period, Professor Fred Urquhart of the University of Toronto developed a tagging program. Recaptures over many years established a southwesterly migratory route for the monarch. But once the monarchs crossed into Mexico, nobody knew where they went. But approximately in 1974, one of Professor Urquhart's associates in Mexico City was traveling through the mountains of Michoacan and came across a hint of the monarchs in the mountains. And then sleuthing the area, he finally discovered this overwintering site. Tens of millions of butterflies in this tiny area of Mexico, which had been there since the beginning of time.
These forests combine the seasonal stability of the tropics with the coolness and the moisture of the mountains. It's not warm enough to breed and lay eggs, so the monarchs are in reproductive cold storage until next spring. There are known to be about 15 separate colonies in the Transvolcanic Range. Precisely how the monarchs find them is still a mystery. From December until March, they eat nothing, living only on fat reserves. But they must drink water, and a stream is crucial to the location of each of the colonies. Brower, his graduate students, and other scientists are trying to piece together the features that make this place so special to the monarch butterfly.
7 years ago we were here, and the butterflies were about a half a mile away from where we're sitting now. And last year we were here too. We've been here every year, but last year the butterflies were in exactly the same place that they are now. And over the years they've been in the same places or very nearby. And there are many different mountain ranges in this part of Mexico, but they only come to a select few ranges. And one of the real mysteries is, why do they do that?
To understand the monarch's life story, it's necessary to appreciate its relationship with milkweed. The ancestors of both modern milkweed and monarch butterflies were once found no farther north than Mexico and the extreme southern United States. About 20,000 years ago, there was a continental ice sheet. One theory suggests that when the ice sheet retreated over thousands of years, milkweed may have spread north, and the monarchs may have moved with the milkweed. But at the end of each summer, they had to return to Mexico. Then, as now, they were truly tropical butterflies. The monarch never adapted to freezing conditions. Instead, it evolved the ability to travel great distances. Alfonso Alonso, a graduate student from the University of Mexico, is tagging butterflies. If this butterfly is recovered when it migrates north in the spring, it will add one more facet to the developing pattern of monarch movements. But first, it must survive the winter, usually mild, but not always.
Winter
So-
storms can be very devastating. In fact, one in 1981, yeah, 20% of the colony froze to death that year. We estimated that year that about 10 million butterflies froze to death. And then after that snowstorm, it cleared and it got extremely cold. And thousands of butterflies started dropping out of the clusters over a period of several days. We also know that the butterflies that are in the center of the clusters are better protected than those that are on the outside. And where there have been any trees cut at all, the storms get into the forest and do a great deal more damage. And so once again, the intact Oyamel forest here is just absolutely of immense importance.
The Mexican government and conservation groups are trying to protect the sites, but land use is a complex and controversial issue in Mexico. To make way for agriculture, fir forests are sometimes partially cleared. And without the fir forests, it is doubtful that monarchs could survive winter exposed to the elements in the mountains. This situation gives a special importance to the research conducted here.
Jim, I was just walking along here looking at all these butterflies that have been eaten by birds, and I found one of Professor Urquhart's tags. Look at that.
Wow, that's amazing. What number is it? 78,900. Wow.
It says on it, send to Zoology, University, Toronto. This butterfly could have been marked in Michigan,
Or Canada.
Maine, or Canada.
Canada or somewhere, yeah.
So that's
amazing.
this is the first one of these I've found in 2 years. In 9 years working here, I found 4.
That's pretty amazing. I wonder how many he's tagged over the years.
Thousands.
Thousands and thousands, yeah.
Chances of getting one are remote. So this is worth its weight in gold.
That's right.
The spring flowers are as important to the monarchs as the fall flowers. After a 4-month fast, the butterflies feast on nectar, storing fuel for the trip back into North America. Like this pair, the entire colony begins to mate before it disperses in late March. Around the spring equinox, the colony moves north. As much as a movement of individual butterflies, the monarch migration is a movement of genetic traits. The inherited characteristics that underlie the migration are strengthened each year. Virtually the only butterflies from east of the Rockies that breed successfully are those that survive the winter by coming here to rest and fast in the cool mountain air. A 100 miles away are the winter quarters of a colony of Mexican free-tailed bats. Unlike the butterflies who come south to fast, the bats come south to feast. What's special about this lake are the quantities of insects that breed here. The insects feed the fish that feed the fishermen. They are also food for the bats that live on the island in the middle of the lake. The bat colony is just under the statue and coexists with the people of a small fishing village just below it. Like the monarchs, the bats are seasonal visitors. They move north in the spring and south in the fall, returning faithfully to this cave, as the monarchs do to their mountains. Around sunset, the colony emerges. First a few, then a flash flood of bats. This happens every night. Their seasonal treks north and south begin like regular nocturnal hunts. One night in the spring, the colony leaves the cave and doesn't return for 6 months. Bats navigate with a precision that is as much of a mystery as the way they pick the timing for their departures. Maybe it's the equinox, maybe a change in the food supply, or the weather. No one is certain. For whatever reason, from many locations in Mexico, the freetails make their way north in April. Many of the bats return to summer quarters at Bracken Cave near Austin, Texas, the largest bat colony in the world. Dr. Merlin Tuttle is a biologist who studies bat ecology and behavior. The breathing mask is a necessity. Without it, he could be overcome within minutes by ammonia fumes from bat droppings in the cave. Dr. Tuttle works to spread information about the benefits brought by bats, from insect control to plant pollination. Even a small colony of only a few thousand eats millions of insects nightly. This one is enormous, containing from 20 to 40 million bats. In a single night of hunting, they devour 250,000 pounds of insects. But they must hunt over a vast territory each night, and then find their way home in the dark from miles away. And once they do that, females must be able to pick out their own young from millions of others. Towards the end of the day, the bats become more active. First one goes, then the air is thick with bats. The exodus can begin long before sunset, and it lasts for hours. Except for nursing young, the entire colony leaves every night. They usually go in the same general direction at first, but if these bats are to find 250,000 pounds of food every night without eating themselves out of house and home, they have to cover a huge area. The colony spreads over thousands of square miles. A single bat may fly 100 miles, twisting and turning. And yet it is able, at the end of its hunt, to fly straight home in the dark. Stragglers arriving after sunrise may find their way by memorized landmarks. Approaching the cave, sometimes from a height of 2 miles, they fold their wings and dive. Inside the cave, they use a sonar system, emitting high-pitched whistles. Echoes bounce off solid objects, warning of obstacles, indicating openings for safe flight. Females are known to return to roosts within the cave, perhaps by hearing the cries of their own young, perhaps by recognizing some subtle contour of the cave wall, but no one really knows. When the colony moves south in the fall, juvenile and adult bats migrate together. But other kinds of migration separate adults and their young. Such animals set off simultaneously in opposite directions, and yet their journeys are paired, essential to the survival of the species. Every spring and fall, a migration passes largely unseen through the estuaries of eastern North America. Sheltered and productive, these waterways are home to the American Atlantic eel, except when it breeds. Until the 1920s, no one even knew where the breeding grounds were, until they were finally found thousands of miles away, east and north of the Caribbean islands, seaward of their fringing coral reefs, in the Sargasso Sea. Adult eels spawn here in late winter. When the eggs hatch, the non-swimming larvae slowly change from leaf-shaped drifters to tiny 2-inch eels. Weak swimmers. At this stage, they must rely on ocean currents to carry them away from the unproductive Sargasso, where there is little to eat. They drift west and north, meeting the Gulf Stream off the Carolinas. It is thought they detect faint traces of river water far out at sea, attracting them toward the land. The first 1,000-mile ride has been on ocean currents. Those that come ashore here at Penobscot Bay will now hitchhike on the great tides of the Gulf of Maine. Researchers from the University of Maine are studying the migration of the juvenile eels as they ride the flood tide inland during late May. They catch eels in nets towed behind a research vessel. At the same time, they record data about the water and the tide in order to try and solve one of the many mysteries of the eel migration. They know that when the tide goes out, the eels drop to the bottom and wait 6 hours for it to flow inland and carry them farther upstream. But how do the tiny 3-inch eels read the tides? Maybe they sense the minute electric fields generated by flowing water. Or they may perceive a change in sound with the turn of the tide. Perhaps they detect a difference in the chemistry of the water, as they might have far out at sea. This tiny glass eel has covered the greatest part of its journey in a year and a half. The rest of the trip, though shorter, may take many years. When eels enter the estuary, some will stay and mature in this salty water. But many will continue inland, riding the tide as far as Bangor, 50 miles up the Penobscot. From here, they must swim upriver. The tide goes no further. Progress is extremely slow. It has been measured at 100 meters in 3 months. No one knows what makes them struggle upstream, but it is a powerful urge, and even great obstacles do not deter them. They get around these by clinging to wet moss, by slipping into cracks, avoiding the full force of the water. Several years later, and 100 miles inland, some of the eels reach the headwaters. They'll stay here for about 10 years, then return to the Sargasso Sea to spawn. Nearly all oceans have eel migrations, but none as long as the Atlantic eels. One theory says its great distance might be explained by continental drift. 200 million years ago, the continents were close together. Then they drifted apart. The line shows a hypothetical range for the ancestors of Atlantic eels, already migratory 150 million years ago. As the Atlantic widened, the migration might have lengthened into the great journey it is today. For the eels that travel to Europe from the Sargasso, the trip is the longest of all. Then, as now, eel eggs could only hatch in salt water. But no one knows what is so special about the Sargasso, or even how returning adult eels find it. It's certain only that they all return here to spawn, and probably die, and that their young must then leave to mature in places thousands of miles away. To find its way, the eel relies on a powerful combination of senses. It has an extremely acute sense of smell that may help it catch prey or guide it to fresh water from out at sea as a juvenile and back to the Sargasso as an adult. Just behind the head, the lateral line runs down the body. It detects sound waves, water currents, and electrical impulses, and may be used in navigation. This adult eel will need a good guidance system. It is September, and it is about to retrace its epic journey. Eels only travel at night, and they wait for bad weather. The first heavy rains of the autumn raise water levels and increase current flow. The torrents of fresh water seem to be a signal to sexually mature eels that it's time to move. During the return journey, their gut degenerates, and they may not eat at all, for they have stored enough fat to fuel a 1,000-mile return swim to the Sargasso. There are many obstacles between the eels and their distant breeding grounds. They will have to face rapids, dams, and waterfalls, and some will get caught in eel weirs. For generations, fishermen have driven stakes into the riverbed here and fastened wooden grills on them from bank to bank. The grillwork lets the water through, but it guides the eels into catch boxes set in the riverbed. When the eels are running heavily, this trap might catch 600 or 700 pounds of them a night. They are running in hundreds of rivers along the Atlantic coast of Europe and North America. By all going to the Sargasso to breed, a genetic mix is assured, and the migratory trait is reinforced. If the mature eels were to stay, they would perish. Their body chemistry is changing, and now they cannot survive long in fresh water. When adult eels leave this river, they will pass another generation of young eels swimming ashore. The instinct to migrate is a powerful, irresistible urge. But it is more than just a genetic trait. It is a strategy that works. For the only eels that breed successfully are those that complete the journey to the Sargasso Sea. Migrations are a long time in their development, and the instinct is strong, but not immutable. It is October in Minnesota. The call of the Canada goose is autumn music along the Mississippi Flyway. But the voice of North America's largest waterfowl has been absent here for 100 years. In the Midwest and throughout most of their original range, trumpeter swans were hunted out for their feathers by early settlers. Larry Gillette of Hennepin Parks near Minneapolis, Minnesota, has been working on reintroducing the trumpeter swan in the upper Midwest.
We have been undertaking this project in an effort to restore the trumpeter swan as a nesting migratory species in Minnesota. And the real key to a successful project is migration. The fear had been raised that these birds had simply lost the instinct to migrate. So it was a great relief to us when in 1984, 29 of our 46 free-flying birds did migrate from Minnesota and traveled down to Missouri, Kansas, and Oklahoma, where they spent the winter. 18 of these birds returned north in the spring. This was the first documented migration of trumpeter swans in the lower 48 states in the past half century. It showed, in fact, that these birds did still have that instinctive ability to enable them to migrate.
The trumpeter swan was once widely distributed. But when early settlers hunted them out, there were only a few groups left, surviving by finding water that was open year-round. So they became non-migratory. In 1976, Hennepin Parks brought some of these to Minnesota. Cold is no problem for the swans, but finding food is. Underwater plants form their natural diet, so when ice forms they must move or starve. In Hennepin Parks, a little water is kept open for swans that need to winter over. But they have to be fed on corn and grain because there is not enough open water for them to feed naturally. It is December 1985. A year ago, 29 swans went spontaneously south. They had never migrated before, so they had to learn the route by trial and error. This year, winter was early and cold. Most of the swans stayed at the preserve as there was little food to be had in the wild. But there were at least 5 that did go south, including some fledglings that had never gone before. Trumpeter swans usually migrate in family groups, so young swans learn the way from their close relatives. But these fledglings were unrelated and probably had to find their own way once they left the preserve. After leaving Minnesota, the swans flew south. Then they disappeared until some were seen briefly in Oklahoma and Kansas, where swans had always wintered. They were not seen again until they returned to Minnesota the following spring. This aggressive display warns other waterfowl to stay away from the nesting territory. Swans tend to mate for a long time, often for life. These rituals reinforce bonds and discourage competitors, such as these Canada geese. This is what the swan migration is all about, surviving the winter in order to take advantage of northern wetlands. The instinct to build a nest is inherited, but some of the skills are learned. Apparently, the same is true of the ability to migrate. By late May, pairs of swans in ponds throughout the preserve have clutches of eggs. And by early June, the pair are parents. This effort to bring the trumpeter swan back to Minnesota is a fascinating study of the causes of migration. Fed by man during the winter, this group of swans does not have to migrate, but some of them do, and no one as yet understands exactly why. This experiment raises many questions, but it has yielded one important discovery. Even after 100 non-migratory years, these swans can still read the seasons, fly in the right direction, and memorize landmarks. Their legacy has not failed. The urge to migrate dies hard. It has been a key to survival for hundreds of thousands of generations, and these swans are still the pathfinders their wild ancestors used to be.
This program was produced by WGBH Boston, which is solely responsible for its content.